my welcome. Thank you, hence my note here. But I want to give you a sense of what tonight's conversation will look like, as well as step back and give you a little bit of context. We chose to focus on gun violence in Chicago because we thought it would be an important opportunity for us to think critically about how to tell a story with nuance and honesty, but also find a starting point to begin to think about the anatomy of gun violence in America in general. To help us kind of think through these issues, we have a fabulous set of panelists. We have Jean-Claude Brizard, the former CEO of Chicago Public Schools. We have Alicia Clark, an alum of the Year of Chicago program. We have Representative Ken Duncan, and we also have Steve Gates, the Chicago Director of the Advocate Programs. So I want to give you also some context. This panel is part of a larger speaker series, and it's called the Black Speaker Series. And the purpose is really twofold. The first is to create a sacred gathering space for people of color to really think about policy that affects those of the African diaspora, but also to extend it to the larger community so that we can begin to think about these issues through a variety of lenses. In terms of creating that space for the Harvard Kennedy School community, there are two people to really think here. The first is Sheila Johnson. As part of the Sheila Johnson Leadership Fellowship Program, the CPL is really partnering with student organizations to create programming around those central missions. And so it really is helpful that she's provided the resources and the space to kind of have this conversation. And CPL is definitely another entity to thank. They really have been very helpful behind the scenes, providing us the space and the kind of expertise to begin creating this kind of programming. And another huge thank you to Haley Price. He's an MPP1 here at the Kennedy School. And really, without his leadership, this really wouldn't have happened. He's put a lot of work and energy into creating this conversation. But the last thank you is to you. We can call people to a table and we can set up chairs, but really it will be up to you to determine what the space actually means and what it will become. So I appreciate you guys for coming. I hope that you continue the conversation, whatever spaces you find yourself in, whether that's in the workplace or in the classroom or just how you live and think about the issues that we pose to you today. And I want to encourage you to continue to take advantage of the wonderful opportunities that have been afforded to us through the Sheila Johnson Leadership Program. And so with that, I think I've done all of my thank yous, and I want to hand it off to Haley. So thank you.
First off, I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank Sharon Fluker and Barbara Best of CPL, who have provided tremendous resources and support throughout the process. So if we can just really excited about the turnout tonight. Thursday night, a busy moment in the semester, or whatever program you're coming from, so we appreciate your time. Don't want to be too formal, but do want to dive just a little deeper in the bios of those on the panel with me. We have a really distinguished group of folks today, and I think it's going to be a very rich conversation. So for starters, we have State Representative Ken Duncan. He insisted that I keep it short, but we can get into just a little bit. He represents the state's 5th district in the Illinois House of Representatives. He was born and raised in the Cabrini Green Public Housing Development in Chicago and currently represents them in the state legislature. Received his bachelor's in political science from Morehouse College and a master's in social service administration from the University of Chicago. He served as a social worker for years and was recently the director of the Robert Taylor Boys and Girls Club of Chicago. I could go on, but I think that gives a good amount of context for his work. Jean-Claude Brizard is currently senior advisor at the College Board, focusing on developing the organization's career readiness initiative. He's the former CEO of Chicago Public Schools and previously served as superintendent of schools for the Rochester School District. Under his leadership, both Chicago Public Schools and the Rochester School District saw improvements in student performance. You may have read about his work. I'm looking forward to chatting more about it this evening, but his record speaks for itself, and we're really lucky to have him here today. Steve Gates, close personal friend, has become a bit of a big brother over the years. I'm really glad he's able to join us. We've worked together in Washington and elsewhere, and really generous of you to kind of join us and spare some time. So thanks for joining us, Steve. He's the Chicago Director for Youth Advocate Programs, Inc., which is a nationally recognized nonprofit committed to providing cost-effective, community-based alternative to institutional placement through direct service, advocacy, and policy change. He's an anti-violence community activist who has dedicated over 15 years to working with youth and their families in one of the nation's most dangerous neighborhoods, Chicago's Roseland community. A native of the South Side, he's received national attention for his advocacy work and shared insights with White House officials, researchers, and advocates across the country. Steve's work has been featured on MSNBC, The Huffington Post, The New York Times, and most recently in Paul Tuck's book, How Children Succeed. Finally, Licia Clark joins us from Year Up Chicago, where she's an alum. She was born on the west side of Chicago and now works at UBS in the Global Asset Management Division as an infrastructure service lead. She's a graduate of the 3rd class of Year Up Chicago, an intensive one-year program that trains 18 to 24-year-old young adults in IT or finance to prepare them for 6-month-long internships and later for jobs with Fortune 500 companies. She still lives in the same neighborhood that she grew up in and is passionate about speaking out on the violence and disconnection that occurs in her community. She's spoken on Capitol Hill with congressmen, the Clinton Global Initiative, and to the Aspen Institute in hopes that these experiences she can bring back to her community and tell folks that they have not been forgotten. So obviously the experiences of the panelists speak for themselves, and I want to make sure we have a chance to have more of a conversation and dialogue than just sort of a transactional back and forth. So kind of starting on the big picture, looking at the state milieu and then getting down to really the neighborhood level, sort of how systems, programs, and policy are connecting, what those intersections might be, and how we can kind of move the conversation in a time with tighter budgets, less resources, and sort of more critical social demands than ever. So beginning with you, Representative Duncan, what are some of the key issues and policy levers you see at the state level, in Illinois specifically, and how does that fit into the context of the national conversation?
Well, first off, I'm happy to be here, Hailing, and you all have read about Chicago over the last couple of years on the tune of sort of the violence that has been portrayed over the media. And I'm here to tell you that it's real. And it's real serious on a lot of levels, given where I come up in public housing in Cabrini Green. For those of you who may or may not be familiar, you all have seen Good Times, right? Candyman, those tall condominiums in the sky. Right now, what we're dealing with are issues of really sort of displaced and abject poverty versus a resource-rich, segmented north side, east side, if you will, the downtown area, versus all those black communities, those brown communities, where there's access to an underground economy that is tremendous. I mean, can you imagine being 19, 22, which most of you all are now for the most part, making about $1,000 a day or $200 a day with little to no education? And then you run across a scenario where other folk want to get in that mix. They want that block. They want that section. And you're in an environment where the demand is so high and so intense, the customers, who are predominantly white or an addicted black population, they're fighting for your time and your attention. And they're giving you money for it. That's one of the undergirdings of sort of the current and now violence. And with us as policymakers not willing to invest the coin into prevention, from after-school programs, real simple, straightforward, preventive programs, the job training, to summer jobs, to after-school work, to really sort of wrapping around services to their parents who may be addicted, who may be grossly uneducated because they were raising kids in an environment that was pretty intense for them coming up. I grew up on the 13th floor of a 19-story public housing unit. You had about maybe 1,400 people in our building alone because there were 2 sections. You had about 8 apartments on each floor, 19-story. There were 7 of us in our 3-bedroom unit. My mother had to deal with a whole lot of sort of child-rearing dynamics with us, with her kids, yes, but she also had to compete against this poverty, for the most part, working class folk who were just isolated. And so, you know, poverty begets violence, and it's justifiable. You can't rationalize it sort of from an academic or policy standpoint. It's just sort of survival of the fittest, and things sort of take its own course. But we have not, my colleagues in the House and in the Senate, and by the way, I'm here on behalf of the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus. I happen to chair the House and the Senate caucus. So this is not a Ken Duncan show. And I am recently been fighting our mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who wants to take us back 10, 15 years and say, lock them up. That's our policy approach. Instead of investing in our schools, investing in our infrastructure, and putting people through a training regimen, if they're an adult, and giving kids a lot of hope. And lastly, when I was coming up, during the pre-crack cocaine era, I didn't realize that I was poor or in poverty until I got to high school, when my classmates started reminding me of my socioeconomic status. And so to see a major dearth of those social services being delivered in our respective community, that's a major affront. And so myself and the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, that's our agenda. And we're intensely serious about it. And we're going to hold up votes at the budgetary level, which I chair one of the committees. I chair the Committee on Higher Education. So the mayor is intense on his in his efforts. We're intense on really shifting the paradigm and coming up with a more comprehensive approach to impacting this generational poverty and violence component.
Thank you. That's a great segue, I think, into sort of looking at the city's systems level. We talked a bit about social services and education. I think a conversation we're seeing increasingly in districts around the country is what's happening outside of the classroom. And the fact is, I think the root cause of a lot of the issues that our low-income students from underserved communities are facing are this dearth in social services that should be supplements to the educational piece. So Jean-Paul, I'm very interested in your perspective on that component.
Sure. First of all, thank you as well for having me here tonight. As an educator, it's hard to separate what needs to happen within classrooms and outside the classrooms. We have to see all of it sort of integrated. Big believer in coherence. But let me talk about perhaps four different things that I think contribute a lot to the issue. One is that access to quality social emotional services for kids in Chicago is almost non-existent, especially within the school structure. In fact, before I got there was no Office of Youth Development in the city school district. So we brought that kind of an agenda to begin to talk about SEL services. Jennifer Buffett of the Warren Buffett family actually funded quite a bit of the work we began in the school district, but it was not comprehensive. It was just really the beginning of the kind of what we have to do. If you want to get a glimpse as to what that means, take a look at a movie called The Interrupters. Just the first 10 minutes. And what you see is a lack of resilience or conflict negotiation skills, right? An argument in the cafeteria becomes a fight, becomes a stabbing, becomes a shooting. And what these interrupters try to do is try to cut the cycle. So what you see a lot of young people without the skills to navigate that kind of conflict. That's one big part of the issue. Another, frankly, is access to the economic infrastructure of the city. So young people, I think 16 to 24, make up about 13% of the population, yet make up 26% of the poverty structure in Chicago. So that's one big problem. In some neighborhoods, the unemployment rate for young people can be as high as 90%. So when you see a lack of access to that kind of economic support, you turn to other things to make do. And you'll see a connection to the dropouts in a second. Before I get to that one, the third big issue in Chicago, frankly, goes back to the expulsion suspension issues in the city. When I walked in, Pedro Noguera says to me, have you seen it? Yeah, I've seen the numbers. So Chicago leads big cities by almost a factor of 3 when it comes to disproportionality. You're talking about overrepresentation of mostly black boys, not Latinos as much, frankly. In New York, it's Latinos and African Americans, but in Chicago, it's mostly African American kids who are overrepresented in the expulsion suspension problem. Let me tie that in for you to perhaps, you see a connection to the SEL piece, right? Now watch a connection to the dropout piece. There is a push out and dropout problem in Chicago. So let me explain, qualify that. To get access to the alternative high school structure in the city, you have to drop out first. There are nearly 60,000 kids on the streets of the city at any given year. There are 25,000 actively trying to access that structure to get back and get a credential. When I became CEO, there were 5,000 seats available for 25,000 kids looking to access 60,000 kids on the streets. That number now is like 7,500 to 8,000. But you see a disconnect, right? And kids who are, first of all, disengaging, at times frankly being pushed out, and now have another access of place to go to get a credential, to get access to whatever we see as a society. So you see the interconnectedness of the issue. There are practice issues and policy issues within the city. I dared someone once to find a 20-year-old in high schools in the city. Because again, by law in Illinois, you can stay in school till the end of the year in which you turn 21. So if you're 21 in November, you can stay in school till June of that year. But you find very, very few kids who are 19 to 20 in the high schools in the city because they've walked away already. So those 4, frankly, are part of the big issue that you see. It connects very, very well, correlates very well to the shooting and crime infrastructure you see, especially in some of the distinct 5 to 10 neighborhoods in the city.
So I guess we're looking at some distinct and overlapping student populations, those in the schools and maybe served by the institution, but those who are disconnected. And I know in the federal policy conversation, there's been increased attention around this idea of disconnected youth, which is roughly, depending on who's defining it, age 16 to 24, those young people that are out of school and out of work. And that's a population Steve spends a lot of his time with. So interested in hearing kind of the other side of that equation. How do you reach folks when they're not as accounted for and not necessarily plugged into these mainstream institutions?
Well, thanks for having me here. And just to kind of piggyback off these two great men, I deal with all of that. We see the culmination of the failure from the federal levels, the disconnected youth, the expulsions, the drugs, and then that's my population. That's who I've been charged to work with. It excites me to have some dialogue about what's really going on. And my intention today was to come out here and hopefully reach somebody here who's going to make some policy or have some power or be in a position to kind of see what's really going on. Because I feel like they're trying to reinvent the wheel. You know, they suspend them, expel them, blah, blah, blah. But there are underlying issues, the poverty, the drugs, the disconnect, the lack of education. People wouldn't believe the level of poverty that is in America, that's in our countries. I've had people, I was Tonto, so I've taken people on tours. You know, I'm the native, so and this is what I've done. So we'll just be able to. I can speak the language. I can navigate those systems, and I've had people from other countries say that the poverty levels are like third world countries. You know, it's like Haiti, or maybe not as drastic as Haiti.
Watch out.
No, it's true, right? But the level of poverty is so low that to begin to talk to a kid about test scores and grades when this kid doesn't know if he's going to eat it, maybe hasn't seen his mom or doesn't know who his mom or dad is, you know, so it's to me, there's a foundation that needs to be set that if we start up here discussing the policies and procedures and the money, we're going to miss all of this. These kids need to learn please and thank you. The things that you guys take for granted, knowing mom was going to be there, knowing that you were going to be able to eat, have someplace warm to sleep, they're not getting it. So I look at my kids sometimes as boy soldiers, almost. You know, the real big deal in Africa about the kid soldiers. Well, I have those kids, and they're not in. You know, we don't have to cross the waters. We can go. You can go right to the south side or the west side of Chicago, and learn about a Yummy Sandifer or another 12 or 13-year-old Darian Albert, babies that are willing to kill and trying not to be killed at the same time, trying to manipulate the legal system, right? They're put under war, under two wars, and I don't want to go off, but no one wanted to support Barack going into Syria because we were already busy, right? I mean, that's just my interpretation. You know what I'm saying? We're already busy. You know, let's put that on the back burner. Are they really gassing those? You know, but Bush was able to go into Afghanistan and Iraq. But my point is this: America traditionally doesn't like to engage in two wars at the same time, and never on our own soils, right? But it's been okay for a war on drugs in our inner cities, in our communities, that affect our children, families, and continue to perpetuate this cycle. It's been a war against violence, a war on poverty. And each war that that our country wages on our people, on poor people, you know, but these are our people. These are the people that build up this capitalistic society that should balance what goes on, right? And they do say that a society is based on how they treat their children, right? I heard that somewhere. You guys are all smart, so help me. But to wage 2 or 3 wars on a group of people is inhumane. And what we're seeing now are the results of the crack cocaine, the war on crack, the war on drugs, the lack of education, the lack of resources. There was a study done. I too, my family was came from Mississippi, the Great Migration from the South, and then ended up on the West Side in the Rockwell Project. And I have an uncle.
What floor they live on?
507.
507.
Yeah, 507. Yeah.
It's Project Talk.
That's Project Talk, right. My grandfather had a garden on the side of the railroad tracks, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway,
They still do that.
where was I?
You're talking about poverty in Chicago and.
Yeah, stop it. My family came up. Thank you.
It's all good.
From the West Side, from Mississippi, the migration to the North, for opportunity, blah blah blah. The projects at one time was safer than the rest of the city. If the projects weren't a bad thing, but then there was a study done with white rats and piling those white rats on top of one another.
That's right.
And the effects that comes out of that, there's a lot of dysfunction that comes out of piling rats on top of each other.
If we can go a little deeper in terms of where you're sort of situated in this battle, I think it would be helpful to kind of walk through what the Youth Advocate Program's kind of intervention looks like and what your entry point is, because all this is, I think, setting the stage really well for where you're meeting these young people.
Well, when we first started with Chicago Public School students, there was a beating. There was a kid that was beat to death, and his name was Darian Albert, and it went viral. Okay, the YouTube, the cell phone thing, it just went crazy, and people made noise. People were outraged. People said that, oh my God, this is terrible. Well, just to let you guys in on a little secret, Darian Albert wasn't the first CPS kid to be beaten with that. He was the first CPS kid to be caught on video. But rest his soul. The Obama administration and Eric Holder and Ernie Duncan came back to Chicago. This was pre-JCB, and they came in and said that, hey, we're going to do something about this. When Mr. Duncan left CPS, he said that I was able to improve the grades, I was able to improve the schools, the expectations, but what I couldn't do anything about was the violence. All right. So then we were granted stimulus dollars. There was a regression analysis done by the Boston Group. So,
Boston Consulting?
Yeah.
the Boston Consulting Group. So that's funny.
Tell them where they met.
Where did they meet?
They met at the Four Seasons Hotel to resolve an issue out in Roseland instead of in the community.
Oh, well, no, they did the research. I didn't see them do the research. I heard about it.
Yeah.
And that's another point. There's so much research. Somebody do something.
You know,
How many times do you have to figure out drugs, lack of education, no money equals a mess? And you know what? Some of the researchers need to put into some of these other entities, because they're making all the money. Yeah, but it's all about the data. Oh, I was going to get to the data. I'm sorry, with this great research. Unfortunately, the Boston Group was called in to have a regression analysis done, where they identified the at-risk kids in Chicago, which would be what? All of them, right? The high-risk kids, which would be all of them, and then the ultra-high-risk kids. And with the ultra-high-risk kids, we were my company was afforded the opportunity to work with out of how many students? About 400,000 students. this regression analysis identified, and you know what, I don't knock that, and I want to finish the regression analysis part, but they identified the top 250 ultra high-risk kids in Chicago public school Chicago public school. So now they said, well, you guys get them. Now, I don't know about you, but for me going to work, you guys aren't going to work yet, right? Some of you are. But for me going to work, I'm looking for shooters. You know, I have to go, you know, I can't pull up really fast.
So you're knocking on doors in the neighborhood.
Right. At night, I can't bag, you know, there's certain, I have to have a shirt and tie on with some cars and a look like, please don't shoot me. But then at the same time, I have to be relatable, you know, so I have to tell them, here's my spiel, guys. When I meet a kid and I'm trying to sign them up for my program, in order for us to even talk, I have to tell these guys, I'm not the police, I'm not probation, and I'm not DCFS, because mom probably has a whole caseload of mess inside the home. So, I'm talking too much, Lisa.
So the intervention strategy, what's to reach the kid?
What reaches for me, our kids and families are what you call H2O. This is really some slick that I got from YAP, so, but you guys can use it and feel free to coin it. Helpless, hopeless, and overwhelmed, right? And when we talk about helpless, hopeless, and overwhelmed, we're not talking about, oh my God, my Citibank bill is due, I don't know.
Right, tell me about it.
You know, we're not talking about that. There is no heat. Mom may be prostitute, dad probably is in prison. Mom may be prostituting the children, you know, to support their habits. I mean, the stuff is so, reality is way deeper than fiction, y'all. You know, there have been times that, I got gray hair, that I would talk to a kid or be in a kid's home and I would get choked up. And there's nothing wrong with being sensitive, guys. I'm not saying that it is, but I'm not really a sensitive guy, but some of the situations that these kids had to live in would make a grown man, I've had to excuse myself. I've been in Principal Dozier's office talking to kids and literally had to get up and remove myself because I couldn't deal with your uncle, you being literally sold to your uncle for sexual favors so that he doesn't move and she doesn't lose that part of the rent that she's not paying because the house is in foreclosure anyway.
Steve, once you're having these conversations, and I know this is something we've talked about, and you share this with policymakers, but once you get the family in the room, you're sort of diagnosing some of the disconnections, right? What does that look like?
They're like 4 principal questions I ask, and you never believe the first offer. You know, these families have been promised things and lied to and failed by sometimes the school system, sometimes the criminal justice system, sometimes the institution of family. That's the first fail. Let me just say that. That institution, once that institution is in turmoil, everything else you can just about bet is going to be troublesome at best. But I'll ask 4 principal questions. What do you need? How can we help? How can we partner together? And how can we give back? Now, what do you need? How can we help? Easiest damn questions in the world. Oh, I need, you know, they have a laundry list, right? But how can we partner together for your children or for your family? It's sometimes impossible to get because the parents are so disconnected, and they are products of they're 30 or 40, so they're crack babies having children, right? And education was never important to them, and the steel mill closed, and they've never seen anybody make it by going to school or graduating, or who is FICA? You know, when we get the kids jobs, who the hell is FICA?
Yeah.
You know, but for somebody who's never had a job or never had a check, or nobody in that household has, yeah, FICA that was the brand money. Now, well, you have to pay taxes, you know. So we'll take that approach, and then we take an individualized individualized approach. So many programs and people and policymakers want to put blanket resource. I mean, like one size fits all, and that's not true. Jimmy may be gangbanging and shooting, but he may have economic issues. Renee may be acting out in school because she's being sexually abused and sold and, you know, raped and beat. There is no, you have to take an individualized approach in order to meet the needs of those clients or of those kids. And we're able to do that. We set up an individualized service plan. We have unconditional caring, whatever it takes, and we really mean that. Ask me, I'm crazy, but we literally try and do whatever it takes.
I think this question of the individualized approach is one that connects a lot with Lisia's story.
Right.
I think it's a great segue in terms of, okay, now that we're down on sort of the family unit, the individual level, what does this look like for someone who has come out of a community like that and perhaps had the resources, but who beat the odds? This was not a likely sort of outcome for you. So what was it that made the difference, and how can these institutions better serve folks back at home?
Well, I haven't beat the odds quite yet. Some light at the end of the tunnel, though. But
All right.
to kind of touch on, you know, what some of these gentlemen have said, I'm so honored to be on this panel with you guys and in front of you all as well. But I heard, you know, Mr. Gates say, you know, hope, the H2O, the hopeless, you know, and I think it's just the overwhelmed. How can these institutions take some of this off of their plate? So the program that I was in, Year Up, it was a support team. I grew up in a home where it was domestic violence, where my father is still addicted to heroin, and we're in there trying to take care of my paranoid schizophrenic grandmother. So our house burned down and everything else. So it's like all of this. So usually parents kind of leave out of the room so the child doesn't get, but I'm in the midst of everything. So little do they know, I'm taking on this as much as I can tell my mom today, which she did a great job. But like, that's heavy, me knowing that this can possibly go off. I'm watching the TV, I'm using the water, why I can't do anything. So it's like, no, it's not hopeless, but I'm just overwhelmed. You go to a counselor, if the little counselors that are in the schools, it's no confidentiality. I've known students who went to say things in confidence and it comes back to the classroom somehow. That's disgusting. You know, like, how can I'm going to drop out. If, you know, like, how could you live like that? I know of guys who dropped out because I'm not going to say the name of school, went to a school and we have Hispanic security guards. The school is mostly Hispanic, and if it's a fight breaks out, the security guards are helping the Hispanics, and it's like, I can't come back. So I'm trying to, I know it's more to everything, and it's more than what I'm seeing, and I'm trying to be in the middle. I'm always in the middle. And how do I not become so overwhelmed and let the light that I know could possibly come for me and my friends? Like, after this, I'm going to go home, and it's great. It's great to go home and tell them, okay, it's more to come. It's people out there trying to talk. I know, like you said, there's nothing being done. Like, I live across the street from a suburb, but it's drugs being sold outside of my apartment. You know, and this is my first apartment. I'm real proud, not of the drugs, but it's like I live across the street from Oak Park, and it's like, how is this even possible? You know, this shouldn't be like, it's just, I don't get it, and I've been so many places to hear so many suggestions, and of course it's obvious, like, the funds are there. If we rearrange, come on, let's rearrange. So if you close 50 schools, it's still not enough money. Like, oh. But, you know, like, it's come on. It's just, we just need to underwhelm the children.
Can you tell us a bit about your experience in Year Up and how maybe that helped lead to some of the alleviation?
In Year Up, I was held to high standards, and I was held accountable. And it wasn't because, oh, she comes from this place, let's kind of, it wasn't, I was understood, but I wasn't, my responsibility didn't lessen. you know, we're here to help you. What can we do? But you still have to be up here. You know, you still have to go and possibly intern at UBS, and now I've been there for 2 years after my internship. So I was held to high standards. I was provided with support. I have a 6-year-old daughter. I'm 24 years old. So I had a lot of things with me, and I have a huge family, but everybody's overwhelmed. The mothers, the grandmothers, the dads, and then the children, of course. It's a trickle-down effect. So support, actual support. Even when they go to school, it's no support. It's a teacher who's upset because this kid comes, he's mad at home, he comes and makes her day miserable, and goes, you know, and it's just like, she probably snaps one time, gets fired, you know. It's bad, but everybody's the whole community is overwhelmed, from the church to, to everything, the stores, my liquor store is open, you know, like from when I wake up to go to sleep. So it's just like, that's where we're going. You know, kids in my generation, we got these new drugs. It's not, you know, it's Molly's and it's all these different things, and it's trying to cope something. So it's not like the expulsion rate reflects the prison, you know, kind of, it goes hand in hand. It's more black men in prison, it's more black kids getting, you know, expelled and suspended. So that's just the world that I live in.
Can you point to specific experiences or interventions you may have experienced along the way that really made a difference for you and maybe changed the way you looked at your situation in this context?
Well, having a paranoid schizophrenic grandmother, I think some things I don't listen to when she says something, but it kind of made me kind of like, oh, the brain, I love, you know, humans, and I understood her in some type of way, because my grandmother, who was paranoid schizophrenic, was molested as a child, you know, and so I was sheltered from the outside world, but not from my inside world. So I was all this chaos inside. Even though I couldn't go outside, it was still chaotic in my house. So I couldn't run the streets, but I was overwhelmed with all of these things. So I just wanted to understand why people did what they did as a young child, and so I kind of carried on to my adulthood.
Yeah, so if we can sort of zoom out a bit, I'd be interested to hear from all the panelists. We talked a lot about the magnitude of the issues, a lot of challenges that we're having sort of on each tier of the systems, but what's working and what has been maybe promised that could be scaled? And feel free, anyone to jump in.
I can reflect on what happened after the Second World War, when Europe had gone through massive devastation with bombs flying everywhere from Europeans and Americans. And they came up with what they called a Marshall Plan. And that Marshall Plan was to provide money for every family there to have an opportunity to build their infrastructure. The infrastructure, not just physically of the property, but of their lives. Everything was about psychologically focusing on how it is that we can rebuild folk to the level of normalcy as we understood it prior to the war. And that took a lot of effort, a lot of resources. But there was a clear understanding across the board, policy-wise, investment-wise, initiation-wise in various countries, and everyone understood that back home. America played a major role with putting that money up. As a matter of fact, we put the lion's share of the coin there. That has to be the same disposition of this country in attacking and dealing with our own war on poverty, our own schools, public schools. You know, this is the wealthiest country in the world. I don't care what they say about China or Europe as a collective body or any other, or this burgeoning and developing Brazil. America is the it. Everyone who is somebody of wealth, of intelligence, who's educated, of fantasy, romanticizes of coming to America to have sort of, you know, put the icing on the cake or take themselves to the next level, because they know what our potential is. I mean, with the inventions of what we've done here at Harvard alone, some of the talent that's come out of here, great talent out of Morehouse and Howard and other places, people want to be here. And you mean to tell me that we can't come up with a resolution on how to segue people in maybe a generation of 10 to 20 years out of poverty, other than just pontificating about it, even as policymakers? We fight all the time of saying, hey, look, we have a limited amount of resources or dollars. We like to invest in this aspect of it. But when some of my colleagues on both sides of the Republican and or the Democratic aisle, when they see black legislators going through this intense dialogue of what it is that we want to do to help bring some resolution, they sort of clam up and say, well, hey, that's not our problem. That's you all's problem. We understand and we accept Chicago being a cesspool of poverty, of violence, with those minorities in particular, and gunplay, etc. That's become a part of the acceptance. But it's not acceptable. Big reason that you all heard a lot about Chicago this summer and last summer is because a lot of that violence in Roseland on the far southeast side, which was devastated back in the 70s, early 70s, mid-70s after the steel mills closed, just like Gary, Indiana, was because those problems and that gunplay started coming downtown. I represent downtown Chicago, the west side of Michigan Avenue. Literally from the Gold Coast to the Soul Coast, on 79th on the south side as well. So that we started highlighting a lot of that now, or back then, and now you go in every corner, you have at least 4 to 6 police officers in downtown Chicago on Michigan Avenue, our magnificent mound, which I proudly represent as well, but also proudly represent where I live in the Bronzeville community on the south side of Chicago, where things can be a little dicey. You have sort of your middle class African Americans mixed in with your working class, mixed in with some of your quote unquote underclass, hopeless folk, our senior citizens. But it's a community. It's sort of like a versioning of Harlem back in around the 20th century, around the Renaissance piece. The only challenge is we as African Americans, we can go anywhere and live anywhere because especially we have little money. So we were isolated at the time prior to the voting rights and civil rights movement. Allowed us to take away some of those covenants to live in certain white neighborhoods because we thought that was going to be better for us, or perceived it as better. And the debate is the verdict is, it is what it is on that. Some folk move into these predominantly white communities, and their kids go through a whole another psychological transformation, and there's no value add. It's actually a deficit. I believe in a healthy mix of diversity. Look at this room here. That's how I see America, and what I do for my own children. So there's some challenging dynamics that are going on. We have to try to break this sort of political impasse amongst our own colleagues in the House and Senate and deal with the root cause of this here. But unfortunately, our downstaters, our suburbanite folk, our rural areas, were dichotomous in our thought, in our day-to-day lives. And politicians, unfortunately, we vote and we move towards and work towards the next election cycle instead of doing the right thing, especially when it stares us dead in the face.
So I think the locus of a lot of this activity would happen in the school. So what does it look like from your vantage point?
So one of the things I've learned in my 27 years in education is that when we're serious about fixing something, you can fix it.
Yep.
In fact, when I got the invitation, I called Liz Dozier, who's the principal of Finger High School,
Yes.
where Darian Albert was killed before she got there, right before she got there. So she's here. So in fact, I'm not going to talk about her success story, and if you don't mind,
Please.
there's a little bit about what's happened to Finger.
Good evening. Good evening. Hi, I'm Liz Dozier, the principal of Finger. I'll make it really short. We are in the Roseland community. I work hand in hand with Steve Gates over the last couple of years, and our school is, all of what the panel said is what really does happen in the community, but there is hope at the end of the tunnel. There's a light there, and we've seen our school transform from having over 300 arrests happen inside the school building my first year there, to reducing that by over 95%. Our freshman on track rate, which is the biggest indicator of success as per the University of Chicago in terms of what makes kids, or the predictor of whether kids will not be successful, at one time was 40% when we first arrived. So it means 4 out of every 10 freshmen who came in would graduate from high school. And so we're now above, we're at 82%, so 8 out of every 10, which was still at the end of the goal, but we made a huge transition in the last several years. Graduation rates up, college enrollment rates went up. And I think that the key to all of that is what the panel is really saying, what each of them are saying. It's relationships, it's resources, it's not building the systems around the adults, and what makes the adults comfortable, building them around the children.
Yes.
And that's so huge for taking a school or taking a community to the next level. So.
Can I ask Liz to talk perhaps more specifically about what you put in place when you got there as a principal?
Oh, sure. So, good evening again.
You should be up here.
The social emotional supports, what Mr. Bazar said, are absolutely critical. And so building in anger management, grief counseling, trauma therapy into the course of the school day, which sometimes people say, well, oh, how can you do that? But if the kids don't have those resources in place, then they can't function in a classroom. When you're dealing with what Mr. Gates talked about, when you're coming to school and you might have seen, it's my community, so I've seen like where there's shootings and things happen. Kids need to be able to process that out so they can be fully open in their minds what you're trying to teach them in the classroom. Having programs like YAP in the building, resources like BAM, mentoring, exposing kids. So every year we've taken them to Washington, D.C., we've taken them to just all over the country to try to show them something different. And providing them basically whatever it takes to get a kid from point A to point B. That might mean driving them to school. That might mean going out to the homes. Steve and I have done, I can't tell you how many home visits, but just doing whatever it takes to move the kids. It's being very strategic and looking at the child as an individual, because as Steve mentioned, it's not a blanket solution. Like every child is different, every situation is different. It's just being very strategic around that.
So if I can add, so if you see the one proof point, right? So the question is, how do you sort of scale up from that very specific example? So the idea of having an SEL initiative across the district. So Jennifer Buffett was one. The folks from the Sean Covey Institute was part of it as well, in looking at that. But having great principals and great teachers who understand about the comprehensiveness and the sort of the coherence around the work, I think is important. If you walk finger, it's not just the guidance counselor or someone else doing the work. It's integrated with the teachers and everyone else, the security guards. Everyone's part of one community pushing together. So it's not just about plopping the program, but about leveraging resources. So the kids that YAP actually handle were kids who are most likely to get shot or shoot someone. Yeah. So getting that kind of intervention around them was part of our strategy. It does not take away the need for rigor, high expectations of kids, right? Understanding where they come from, but not making excuses for them they can't learn, right? So all of the education stuff that we know work has to be part of the fabric of the work. The early interventions, again, have to be a fundamental part of what you look at as a system. I think one of the mistakes we often make, though, in the school districts, in Chicago for one, was that we didn't connect enough to the outside infrastructure, the children's family services. That being really well integrated into the fabric of the work is part of the challenge of execution in a place like Chicago. So it can happen, right, if everyone pulls together and decide we're going to make this work for our kids.
I'm hearing this theme, kind of comprehensive integrated services, and kind of addressing this question of social isolation, actually. This is a conversation that we had with some research folks. It was at Child Trends about a year or two ago, and it's a theme that comes up so much in this work. How do we connect these young people in a meaningful way to the institutions that traditionally been failing them? So sort of on the individual family unit level, what does that look like, and where can we really meet these people?
Well, we have to, you got to be, there's a level of understanding and empathy that you have to have for the families. I mean, not feeling sorry for them, which may very well be the first response or first instinct, but trying to see them empower themselves, if that makes sense. And I'm just a vehicle. The plan is JCB's. The plan is Lisa. She wants to go to college, graduate. I'm just a vehicle. I'm just a tool. So I can help her access information and resources that she may not be aware of. And that's a term that is so loosely and freely thrown around.
What term is that?
Resources. Because there's varying levels of resources. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, like Ms. Dozier was talking about in John Clark. You have to know how to access what you need and utilize it to the best of your ability. And there's one resource that's taken for granted, and that's the human resource. People think about human resources and just think about the W-2s and but the actual human resource, people change people. People encourage each other. People, I mean, we're social beings, right? So just imagine if, and we talked about, I want to touch on this also. Just imagine if these kids aren't taught please and thank you, right? And they've been sold an illusion about this machismo and the disregard for life, and that it's okay, and to be a man you have to go to the penitentiary, and the rules from the penitentiary sometimes come back to the home, and without the proper human resource, because they're examples. You know, these guys are going to find examples, one way or another. But the right example, the right resource, it is critical. And until we invest in please and thank you again, Barney probably should be played. Now this is going one joke, and I'm gonna leave you guys alone. Anybody? You guys might be too young for Barney. No, probably my sister. Okay, so you're just right. Okay, all right. So I went to college. I went to college, right? And when on break, I had to come back, and my mom had a baby like 18 years later. But that's I don't want to tell her. But I was keeping my baby sister. Have anybody ever heard that? My sister, I love my. It's with a baby bop. And the other chick, you know, that she talking about how she loves her sister, and I just got so choked up. But nobody's teaching her. They cut Barney off. You know, you don't get please and thank you in the house. You get you riding some gun. You're not gonna. You lose. You're just like your daddy. He may not even know who his daddy is. You know, she has problems with education, so she's intimidated to go talk to Ms. Dozier. You know, so in order for us to kind of bring trust back to some of these failed institutions, family being the first, we have to be genuine. You can't be scared. And kids and families are the first ones to smell a rat or a phony.
That's right.
You know, and know that. Know that. And then the commitment has to be there. I'm thinking about what JCB said, and the crime lab, now don't quote me on this, but somebody could probably look it up. Chicago Crime Lab says that most kids are violent or shoot each other not because of drugs and strategic gang actions and meetings and strategies or territory. Most kids are violent and shoot each other because they haven't learned the social emotional piece. They haven't learned how to cope with frustration and rejection and hard work and drugs and mental illness and poverty, and they haven't learned how to deal with that emotionally. And what they're being taught, their examples, are giving them illusions. You know?
I think Licia's perspective here would be really helpful in terms of coming from a place where a lot of these social norms and often toxic social norms are kind of reinforced. So what does that look like in your experience, and how can we really penetrate on the community level in terms of values and some things that folks do have awareness of? We don't want policy telling our black and brown mothers and fathers to raise their children in a specific kind of way. So what would that look like in a more constructive manner?
Well, a couple of things it shouldn't look like is me being outside and a tank, an army tank coming through my street. You really can't protect me or my daughter because you're inside of the tank, I'm not. And another thing is...
Listen, you got to know that they talked about bringing the National Guard to Chicago. That's what she's talking about.
Yes, the tank
Some of my colleagues
came through my block.
Thanks, man.
I didn't say it was me.
But, imagine being outside of your house and the detectives just come and swoop in, and I don't have anything to do with anything, and I have to take my shoes off and snow outside. I have to, sit my daughter with another officer, and I'm just like, huh? All because I'm outside of my home. So besides the tank and the raids for no unnecessary reason, then they drive off or whatever, that's what it should not look like. What I was always thinking about, like a linear communication between, the teachers and the principals and the parents, but it should actually be a circle. It should be that student in between these people, and communication going and is understood by each of the people who have an aspect in the child's life. We can't, you two just can't go to the doors, you know, like, it's great, but it's like, okay, how many times do we have to come to your door, you know, for you to come to ours, you know, where you send your child every day to her school. And so it's just like, I would love for the child to be in the middle of some support, so whichever way they fall, they can always bounce back.
That's powerful. So we want to open up the Q&A in just a moment, but most of our registrants were able to submit some questions beforehand, so we have a few prepared for the panel, and then we can open it up based on what we've heard today. So one is on kind of the way these issues are framed. So we talked a bit about what happens when this occurs in my community, or, you know, that's not our issue, it's happening on the other side of town. And I think we see that manifested a lot of the times in the media. So this has emerged in the national consciousness now that, you know, we see this on Dateline. This isn't anything new on the south side or the west side of Chicago. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on how these stories are told and sort of how that shapes the conversation, whether or not that's a constructive thing.
Can I start? So one of the most difficult things I had to face when I got to Chicago as CEO was the constant emails I would get, you know, Monday morning. Monday morning was always the worst one. You get a list of kids who had been shot that weekend, those who had been killed that weekend. And I had a habit of calling every parent whose child was actually killed. So as a parent, it was the most difficult thing I had to do. Listening to a mom on the phone on the other side talk about, can you help me get out of here because I have another son, they're going to kill him too. So that was very painful. But the one thing that my wife and I, who's a teacher by the way, former teacher, talked about often was how the shootings were portrayed or painted. So once they put the label gang on top of the shooting, all of a sudden it was sanitized. It was okay. We live in Lincoln Park, part of the city, right? So somewhat in the bubble, right? We call it the Northside bubble. But I live, frankly, my days were spent in Englewood and in Garfield.
It's a very nice neighborhood.
Yes. So but my days were spent in parts where my kids live, right? But somehow the way the stories are being told made it okay and acceptable because those kids were involved somehow in gangs. So how is the stories told? The fact that we are, I think, as a community, in the city, like the country, responsible for those kids being where they are, meaning in the gangs, is not told. That when a child is killed by a fellow gang member or somebody else, we are the ones who create that situation, either by them dropping out of school, not providing the right kinds of, all kinds of things we're talking about today. So how the stories are told, I think, is really critical. And watching now some of the newspapers like the Tribune and others were talking about each family, each story individually. That was putting a face and a name and emotions behind that, now makes it real and makes it really personal.
And unfortunately, some of the highlighted cases or issues, aside from the Finger High School, because again, that went viral, but we've seen, if you're a middle class, if your parents are middle class or educated, and you know, Hadil Pennington's family lives about 5-6 blocks away from where I live. And yes, we hear about, you know, to your point, we hear about the, you know, sort of the, okay, here's the gang title, and folks just sort of flip the page because it's sort of a regular occurrence. But if there's a middle class kid who had a great deal of promise, such as Hadil Pennington, and listen, as a parent, there's no way in the world that I can even fathom trying to internalize that level of intense pain. I mean, that's, you know, that's, I've talked to her father about 2 weeks ago, a couple Saturdays ago, but the common scenario was what you articulated. It was those individuals who were below the, you know, the high-end or middle class, right, over there in that neighborhood. It's expected. Right. And then my policymaker, my politicians, we become desensitized. And so it's like, listen, are we going to throw pearls at swine and sort of in their mindset? And, or is this something that we should accept given the factors of capitalism as well? Capitalism pursues abject wealth and resources, survival of the fittest, and those who are below are part of that abject poverty configuration that's, again, a part of the American way. We exercise some of these exploitations over in Africa and Asia, South America, and the Caribbean. We've proven that. You go there and extract the resources out of it. You don't process, you don't develop anything there, and you go to your wealthy transfer point or country, and that's where you really sort of make things shine. I mean, who place value on gold and oil dependency? It's us developing countries. I really think that if you look at the way capitalism is administered and configured, it breeds violence or poverty, which of course, poverty, and then violence ensues shortly after that. So it's, we have to shift the way in which we conduct ourselves as a society and what our value is. Then that compounded with this fast-paced media that celebrates violence and indifference, misogynistic approaches towards our women. I mean, it's, these dynamics are moving all sort of at a very, very rapid pace, and then we're consumed with it. Then so a lot of us are overwhelmed. And again, as policymakers, we try to figure out, all right, what's the best fit? If you put money over here in the schools, oh, but mom has a serious drug issue. Oh, then there's some mental health issues that are latent in our community, in churches and synagogues and mosques. That's what they should address them, especially if you have a working class, poor community or environmental constituency. They'll take care of that. So we're dealing with a multiplicity levels of issues as it relates to the human spirit, and then sort of where we are as a society as a whole.
I want to go a little deeper on that last point you made. It actually leads to our next question around mental health. So we talk a lot about whether it's Middletown or Littleton, almost a generation ago now, looking at the role our mental health institutions and service providers play in violence. And I think it's often an elephant in the room, whether it's research, policy. A lot of these debates have either skirted around it or maybe psychologized it in other contexts and not in low-income communities. So we hear often, and this is the way the question was framed from the audience, is there a stigma in our communities around seeking mental health, receiving those services? What role does that piece play, and how do these institutions play a role in this larger question?
I can just say flat out yes. I don't know if any community who readily accepts or really, it's probably magnified in the black community because of the sense of shame or another sign of weakness or vulnerability. So it is magnified, but there's also not only mental illness issues that are stigmatized, but just to be frank with you guys, until I started working with kids, I always thought that that molesters, that sexual molesters, before Oprah said she was molested, I was taught, oh, that's what white people do that. Black people don't do that.
That's a stereotype.
But the illusion, they were putting that, I'm just being truthful, right?
Speak truth.
So now, when I'm working with these kids that are being sexually molested regularly, and then now that other black people are saying, hey, it happened to me. Hey, it happened to everybody. So not just mental illness, that's a stigma, but there are a couple things. The sexual molestation is a stigma.
Do you think the mental health piece has implications for the violence?
In Chicago, the sheriff was just awarded, they're going to start looking at mental illness as an issue as opposed to just arresting them for. This just broke about a week or two ago. Cook County Jail was probably Chicago's largest mental institution facility. Period. Bottom line. That's just what it is. Now, do our kids for black males, mental illness hits about 17 or 18, right? Now, just ride with me for a minute, you guys. We do nicknames, right? Everybody, like Pinky, Peggy. See, these kids are nicknamed Killer, and Crusher,
right,
Pookie. So now we're reinforcing, and we're asking or we're pushing a self-fulfilling prophecy on these kids. Killer, murder, so now on top of that, with some mental illness issues that are taboo, this guy with this illusion, wanting to have this respect, crazy as hell, tough situation, do I rob this dude, or do I sell drugs, or do I rob the dude? Because lack of resources,
Yeah.
right? If this kid could have gotten what he deserved, got the correct resources, like, hey, you know what? You're bipolar. That's what that is. That's manic.
Exactly.
Right.
You know, that if we were able to open that up, that could potentially be 3 or 4 or 5 people's lives saved,
Right.
just by being honest.
Right.
Yeah, I know this hits home for Licia as well, so before we open it up to the audience, I'm wondering if you have anything to add to that.
Well, I had a problem. I don't know if I'm like mentally ill per se, but I had a problem with opening up and letting people know my story. But as I started to talk, it was like stress. Like, how can I get what I try to tell my friends is like, how can you expect to get more if you got your hands like this?
Right.
You know, how can your cup, you know, if your cup just already tilting, like, pour something out in order to get something new. So that's what I try to be that voice to tell them you can't, you gotta let it go, because if not, it'll just eat at you and harbor anger. Anger presents violence a lot of the times in my neighborhood, and that's a lot of anger. It becomes mental illness when it doesn't have to be. So things, if they could start, if talking to people could become the norm soon, before it becomes mental illness in that child or youth, a lot could be done, because I think I wasn't angry out loud, but inside I was. I didn't share. For what can you do for me? I didn't trust, like, you're going to go back and tell, like, you did this student, or you told my aunt what I told, you know, so it's like trust, and it's just like, to get more, you got to give something. So I think if we catch it early, it could resolve a lot before it actually becomes a mental illness.
Sure. Thank you. Sure. So before we wrap, definitely wanted to take some time to engage the audience and see if there are any targeted questions or general queries you pose to the panel as a whole. So let's see one in the corner.
Thank you so much for being honest. So
You gotta tell us your name
Oh,
first.
so my name is Amy, and I was a public defender and actually represented a lot of youth offenders. And I spent a lot of my time trying to get, not in Chicago, I did this in LA, but I spent a lot of time trying to get children who were just started in the criminal justice system back in school. And that was a massive time suck that like was incredibly frustrating, and actually I think when you don't get them back in school, leads them to the cycle of violence. So I'm curious, in Chicago, what are you guys doing around that issue? Like, people who just start entering, because I'm just curious how you're working through that in Chicago, and maybe sort of broad brush, how do we focus on that nationally? Because I think that that's such a key point.
It is. And I mentioned this before, you have some of my colleagues pushing for Rahm Emanuel's initiative on mandatory minimum sentencing. If you're caught with a gun, and here it is, the state of Texas, the state of Georgia, Pennsylvania have moved away. Nationally, there's a trend of moving away from mandatory minimums because they do not work. It is not a deterrent. What we do know is that the state's attorney's office, who prosecutes folk, they are overwhelmed. They are, and I think in Cook County, they're averaging about 150 cases a week at a minimum. I mean, you talk to a state's attorney in a place like, I guess, New York or in LA, especially in Cook County, where there's a lot of activity going on. They don't have the time to really sort of process what they're doing or how they're impacting the lives of these kids.
Public defenders are overwhelmed too.
Absolutely. Right. So yeah, if you have a prosecutor, you have a public defender, and so it becomes sort of a rote motion and emotionless connection with these kids, and the result ends up with that black boy or that black girl, especially if they have no family support or resources, they're locked up. And so our mayor wants to make this his answer, his political answer. Who is he talking to? Your middle upper class whites? You're trying to talk to the media? You're talking about is our police superintendent trying to come up with a quick fix policy? So if you introduce mandatory minimums, that's going to resolve the intensely internal and personal conflicts that go on in these communities that we've discussed here, that a lot of you all are familiar with? Absolutely no. And so what I did, because I guess how we got connected, was use a parliamentary procedure in the House of Representatives to stop that bill, and then the speaker immediately adjourned. We didn't even talk about the financial impact. That's the reason that Texas, Georgia and Pennsylvania and all these other states are going away from it because they can't afford it.
Yeah.
You need everyone who's caught up don't necessarily need to go to prison. They need to do community service. And I'm not soft on crime by any means. Believe you me. I've seen folks' face get blown off. I mean, I come from that level of intense poverty that you all are very familiar with. It wasn't sort of block by block. It was all of us were in the same building. And so I'm saying let's come up with an appropriate response to legislation that's responsible. Not just, hey, look here, politically I want to make sure that I appease everyone, that I hush the media up, and this mandatory minimum is here. Then the superintendent, getting paid $300,000+ a year, can't figure it out, not talking to the right people on the ground, even his own troops are saying, we don't need any more police to prevent crimes. Because if you know that, if you pull a gun right now here and shoot it, you can get up to 10 or 16 years just by shooting the gun. And if you know that there's a high probability of you being caught, you're less likely to create a crime. So we're ignoring that. And so there was a major fight in Springfield. And so I'm going to continue to push for that fight and educate my colleagues that that's not the answer. Forget that we can't afford it. It's just irrational. I haven't met one judge who wants us to take away their discretion. Why have judges then?
Right.
You can have an administration of rules of certain crimes. Every crime does not fit a particular stereotype. And we're bigger than that. And I know our mayor is bigger than that. But he's trying to respond politically. Again, remember, politicians, we look for our next election. How to stay in office, how to be the man, the woman. We're dealing with our egos as well, which is sad. But I think most of us should be in this to add some value and help out and not worry about the political consequences. I was getting my butt kicked voting for same-sex marriage in my district. Even though I represent downtown, the majority of the voters are on the south side. Churches, singers, they ain't playing that. They gave me an earful. But I believe that there should be equal protection under the law for everyone.
Thank you. So let me just add a bit to your
I'm not
question.
sure if I
First
answered
of all,
the question.
there's a nomenclature. The superintendent in Chicago is the police, not the school. So just
Oh, yeah, that's right.
to clarify that. So just quickly paint a picture for you. Your question about getting kids back in school is a very difficult one. I think it's one in every city, but it's much more difficult in Chicago. There's a high school problem, right? So one is that you have principals who are overwhelmed with those kids. So the moment they get incarcerated, they're quick to drop them from their enrollment. So not my problem anymore. So part of it is accountability around the enrollment, around making sure kids are going to come back to school. Part of it is how you calculate graduation rates to make sure the denominator is sort of consistent, so you keep people accountable to that. Part of it is access to other kinds of programs that may be appropriate for that child, that he or she may not belong at Harper or whatever the high school is going to be because they can't handle the particulars of those kinds of challenges. So it's all the above. It's one we begin to actually address, but frankly is light years behind what needs to be done for the entire city. So accountability, access to quality program, and connections, frankly, to the juvenile justice system in Chicago.
Really, really quickly, just to piggyback, and this might not even be picked up, might have been a lie. I think about Michelle Alexander, mass incarceration, especially when Representative Duncan talks about these mandatory minimums. I don't know if it's designed for the kids to be filtered back into school. I'm beginning to be of a school of thought where the school of prison pipeline looks more feasible and looks more like what's happening to me now. So just a note.
Can I do one too? I actually was out of school, high school, for 347 days. It was impossible for me to get back in school. I wasn't over. It was because I was transitioning from a South Side school that I was like, I can't go back there, to my actual neighborhood school. We had to go downtown like numerous times, me, my mother, and my grandfather, to try. It's not designed for me to come back, especially me.
It's way too difficult.
And so it was, and I still graduated in 4 years, but they wanted to hold me back. I asked the lady, my mom had to stop talking to me. I said, you're not doing me a favor. If I fail, I fail. So let me try to succeed. Don't just count me out. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your insight. I'm from Chicago. I taught Head Start on the west side.
West Side.
And I wanted to speak to you or ask a bit about, we've talked about interventions that happen after the violence has occurred, later in a child's life or in a youth's life. And we haven't spoken so much about the interventions that can happen early, apart from the broad sort of picture that we paint that we need more support services for kids. But we know from the science that it is more cost effective, easier, and shorter to do to provide those interventions early on. But as someone who has worked in the early ed system in Chicago, it's very disconnected, it's low quality. There are a lot of barriers to making it better. And I'm wondering if we know that, like, what is kind of holding back the city and our nation from investing more resources up front and having a conversation about what can happen up front from what happens later on.
It's quite started, so it's also underfunded, right? So,
Yeah.
so I worked in New York City schools for 22 years, and grew up in New York, and we had universal pre-K across the entire state. Not great, but frankly, a really good start. As a parent in Chicago, I was paying $13,000 a year to send my 4-year-old to school. So a lot of parents pay tuition for pre-K, and the universal, the one that's funded by the state and the city is inadequate. And frankly, the state of Illinois every year cut funding, the block grant to the city, which made it much more difficult to offer pre-K to more parents across the city. So there is an effort underway trying to raise the quality. I brought the person I had in New York to Chicago. She's working hard, but against the odds because she doesn't have the money to do what needs to be done. So the quality stuff is being looked at right now. The access piece is quite challenging, and for most middle-income families, they're paying $10,000 to $14,000 a year to send their kids to pre-K.
I remember those days very clearly. We're pathetically number 49, maybe 50th state in the nation in terms of our investment in education. And common sense would state that early investment is the answer, but it is so difficult to get my colleagues to want to invest, because we have conservative Democrats, conservative Republicans, etc., and some people just don't care, and they're elected. I mean, that's reflective in our nation's capital, and it's all across the country in some of these state capitals. Inexcusable for us not to invest in the kids early on. I mean, empirical data, common sense, it's the embarrassment of being an elected official and knowing that factor is still prevalent in our state and in our country. So that's why I advocate very strongly for those dollars. But we come up with so many excuses for not wanting to invest in our babies. And we lose immediately 10 and 13. That's when you really see, sort of the return on investment going bad or going great.
I mean, I just want to say that don't think for 1 second that some of these kids are just being written off, based on their poverty or where they live. Some kids aren't important, and that's just the truth. And they start being unimportant as babies, and then as elementary school, they continue to be unimportant. By the time they go to high school, they're able to be written off.
Right.
So I'm Jacob. Really appreciate you guys all being here. I think because you mentioned sort of the dollars, fighting for those dollars, it sort of triggered this question, because I think so often at Kennedy School, and I think in the broader discourse, I hear a lot about management. That it's sort of a management problem that we have. It's almost the assumption is like we have the resources, but people aren't being held accountable, and we need better metrics. We need the right incentives to make sure that teachers, principals, superintendents, caseworkers do their job better than they're currently doing their job, right? And I guess my question is, how much do you guys think we can move the needle if that's sort of the narrow approach we're taking? And versus, I'm hearing a lot of other things that you guys are raising in terms of the need to invest in early childhood, to invest in the social and emotional supports, things that do, at the end of the day, we can't really get around the fact that they require money, more resources. And so, to the extent that you guys feel comfortable kind of weighing in to this question and this issue, it's something that I think folks are thinking about.
So there's a great organization called Education and Resources Strategies based right near Boston. There's a lot of this work around school funding, and it's a very, very complex, very political issue. So the answer is all of the above is yes. So tons of inefficiencies within school districts, right? We all know that. At the same time, too, the way we structure funding of schools is also structurally inadequate,
Yes.
inequitable, right? Property taxes, etc. So all the above is absolutely correct. If you talk to Liz Dozier, she'll tell you she did amazing work in moving that school, but all the funding that came is gone now because it was funded from a source that was finite. So not on top of that, actually, it was actually government. It was finite.
Stimulus.
Actually, turnaround money, right?
Yes.
SIG money. So when you look at how we fund, we don't fund for sustainability.
Right.
We don't look at the efficiencies that we need to find. There are laws that prevent money from being spent in a way that may make sense to a principal, but dictated by law, whether federal or state, sometimes local laws. So we actually have a structure in our country that dictates how funding, so you can't commingle funds in a way that may make sense to you as a school system or as a school principal. So the answer is yes, all the above.
Well, I'd like to add to that. Here's what we don't like talking about, especially politicians and folk who are, when we become educated, we don't like talking about the institutional racism that exists here in America when it comes to equitable distribution of resources, when it comes to education in particular, because that's the great equalizer here in this country. With me being on the 13th floor in the public housing and the projects, me going to Morehouse, going to University of Chicago, and I was the only brother in my class, that put me at an equal level with a number of you and my other peers. That gave me a level of confidence and a level of foresight. And by the way, right to this day, right now, I have my oldest brother in the joint, my sister back and forth in and out of the joint, my second youngest brother locked up right now in the penitentiary. But I found my way of connecting with greater society because I was engaged in school, started paper route early on. I clicked up with the athletes, the fine women. It was sort of a good mix for me. And I was incentivized to get into some of these programs. Hey, look, I tell brothers all the time, I say, look, go to, exactly. Look, when I was at Morehouse, I took classes that spell me. It was in my face. So, and I tell brothers, I say, look, if you go to college, man, it's like 6 to 1 on the black side.
6 to 1.
Look, 6 women to 1 of you.
Oh, you were at Morehouse.
No. I'm saying I speak to us in general, but I mean that stuff is just real. I mean, so can you imagine saying, look here, let's shift how we fund education instead of property taxes, which is so crazy and ass backwards. You know, damn well, a wealthy community is going to have more resources than a poor neighborhood. In Chicago, we should be having this conversation in 2013. There needs to be a simple formula, a nationwide formula of how we fund education. That'll resolve a lot of these issues of access to a real bright future, in addition to early childhood education.
And I hate to cut this short because this has been a very rich conversation. So
Well done.
before we close, I'll say that we're going to officially wrap up at 7:30, but our panelists will be around for another hour, so we can definitely continue the Q&A and hopefully continue this really rich dialogue. But out of respect for folks' time, I think it would be great if we just went across and maybe shared a 30-second takeaway. What is, given the folks who are in this room, educators, maybe future policymakers and advocates, we've heard maybe too much resources around the research piece, not enough investment in sort of fostering connections and thinking about how institutions are really meeting children where they are, thinking about the implications of the intersections, right? So health systems, education, criminal justice. So with all that in mind, just sort of one bullet point for folks to walk away with and think about as we close.
Ladies first.
Well, one bullet point. They have more attachment to the government than I do. I live in one of the most corrupt cities in the country.
Really now?
So, yes. And where can you start? I'm really at a loss, but it seems like it's designed for us to fail. So how do we redesign it? And that's all.
Steve, if we can, 30 seconds, bro.
It got good to me. We need to do this every week. For me, just really broadly, it may be so simple and stupid, but I've been called a bunch of things but if we can get the policymakers and all you brilliant people to kind of understand better what's going on at the ground level, the funding levels, the education, the early educational levels, and then we can also teach the people that we're trying to reach what the expectation is and how to raise the bar. And then there's some common dialogue so that we have a common goal. You know, we won't be all over the place. Then I think we'd be better fitted in whatever our journey is, because we're trying to understand more about what's going on. We want you to understand more about what we expect. Let's meet in the middle. Let's meet in the middle. So.
A lot of people look for a silver bullet to fix these really comprehensive and complex issues. It didn't take 5 years to get here. It's going to be many more years to actually fix it. But it has to be an all approach in all the ways. It's not just great teachers, not just great principals or great curriculum. It's everything that we do from early childhood all the way up, from prenatal care all the way up. We've got to look at this comprehensively. It's going to take a generation.
I think if we, as from policymakers to folk at the ground level, the educational level, just approach our colleagues with a level of empathy and understanding, and mainly the people that we really want to impact with a healthy dose of love, you can play a major role in opening yourself up to some clarification of various cultures and respecting people, and then backing it up with some resources or dollars, technical support, not just from you, but from the private source. Government, we wouldn't be nothing. This university and institution would be nothing without the private resources that made it what it is. This rooms, most of these rooms and buildings are dedicated from someone. That was done out of dedication and commitment, but love, I really think, in the sense of unselfishness. That plays a role. We're all of us are God's kids. And we need to act accordingly, because at some point we're going to be knocking at the door trying to get to heaven.
Thank you. It's a powerful idea to close on. I just want to thank our panelists again. I think this was a really unique and a privilege to sit up here with you all. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with folks in the room. Refreshments are outside, and again, our panelists aren't going anywhere for a little while. And before we close, we're going to have some folks make some closing announcements.
If I could just make a quick plug, it seems like given this room that we have.
So now, who are you?
Oh, my name is Marissa Davis, and I'm in my second year here at the Kennedy School. Mark your calendars for April 4th through 5th. That is going to be the 10th annual Black Policy Conference that we'll be having here at the Kennedy School, where we will be speaking on a number of issues related to the Black community and looking at it more comprehensively. And I think given the space and interest that we have here, I would imagine many of you would be interested in attending. So please, April 4th through 5th, don't forget.
All right.
One more. I think, isn't tomorrow, no, I did a little research too.
Yeah.
Doesn't tomorrow mark Kennedy's 50th?
Yeah.
Right.
Isn't this ironic to me? I mean, it's just
No better time to have a
about
conversation.
gun violence, right?
Yeah.
So it ain't just killing blacks either. So it's a problem, though.
Hi, I'm Candace Mitchell, and I'm an MPP2 here at the Kennedy School, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here to this space. As it turns out, my welcome has been thank yous, hence my note here. But I want to give you a sense of what tonight's conversation will look like, as well as that fact that give you a little bit of context. We chose to focus on gun violence in Chicago because we thought it would be an important opportunity for us to think critically about how to tell a story with nuance and honesty, but also find a starting point to begin to think about the anatomy of gun violence in America in general. So to help us kind of think through these issues, we have a fabulous set of panelists. We have Jean-Claude Bouchard, the former CEO of Chicago Public Schools. We have Alicia Clark, an alum of the Year of Chicago program. We have Representative Ken Duncan, and we also have Steve Gates, the Chicago Director of the Advocate Programs. So I want to give you also some context. This panel is part of a larger speaker series, and it's called the Black Speaker Series. And the purpose is really twofold. The first is to create a sacred gathering space for people of color to really think about policy that affects those of the African diaspora, but also to extend it to the larger community, so we can begin to think about these issues in a variety of lenses. In terms of creating that space for the Harvard Kennedy School community, there are two people to really thank here. The first is Sheila Johnson. As part of the Sheila Johnson Leadership Fellowship Program, the CPL is really partnering with student organizations to create programming around those central missions. And so it really is helpful that she's provided the resources and the space to kind of have this conversation. And CPL is definitely another entity to thank. They really have been very helpful behind the scenes, providing us the space and the kind of expertise to begin creating this kind of programming. And another huge thank you to Haley Price. He's an MPP1 here at the Kennedy School. And really, without his leadership, this really wouldn't have happened. He's put a lot of work and energy into creating this conversation. But the last thank you is to you. We can call people to a table and we can set up chairs, but really it will be up to you to determine what the space actually means and what it will become. So I appreciate you guys for coming. I hope that you continue the conversation, whatever spaces you find yourself in, whether that's in the workplace or in the classroom or just how you live and think about the issues that we posed to you today. And I want to encourage you to continue to take advantage of the wonderful opportunities that have been afforded to us through the Sheila Johnson Leadership Program. And so with that, I think I've done all of my thank yous, and I want to hand it off to Haley. So thank you.
First off, I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank Sharon Fluker and Barbara Best of CPL, who have provided tremendous resources and support throughout the process. So if we can just... Really excited about the turnout tonight. Thursday night, a busy moment in the semester, or whatever program you're coming from, so we appreciate your time. Don't want to be too formal, but do want to dive just a little deeper in the bios of those on the panel with me. We have a really distinguished group of folks today, and I think it's going to be a very rich conversation. So for starters, we have State Representative Ken Duncan. He insisted that I keep it short, but we can get into just a little bit. He represents the state's 5th district in the Illinois House of Representatives. He was born and raised in the Cabrini Green Public Housing Development in Chicago and currently represents them in the state legislature. Received his bachelor's in political science from Morehouse College and a master's in social service administration from the University of Chicago. He served as a social worker for years and was recently the director of the Robert Taylor Boys and Girls Club of Chicago. I could go on, but I think that gives a good amount of context for his work. Jean-Claude Bizard is currently senior advisor at the College Board, focusing on developing the organization's career readiness initiative. He's the former CEO of Chicago Public Schools and previously served as superintendent of schools for the Rochester School District. Under his leadership, both Chicago Public Schools and the Rochester School District saw improvements in student performance. You may have read about his work. I'm looking forward to chatting more about it this evening, but his record speaks for itself, and we're really lucky to have him here today. Steve Gates, a close personal friend, has become a bit of a big brother over the years. I'm really glad he's able to join us. We've worked together in Washington and elsewhere, and really generous of you to kind of join us and spare some time. So thanks for joining us, Steve. He's the Chicago Director for Youth Advocate Programs, Inc., which is a nationally recognized nonprofit committed to providing cost-effective, community-based alternative to institutional placement through direct service, advocacy, and policy change. He's an anti-violence community activist who has dedicated over 15 years to working with youth and their families in one of the nation's most dangerous neighborhoods, Chicago's Roseland community. A native of the South Side, he's received national attention for his advocacy work and shared insights with White House officials, researchers, and advocates across the country. Steve's work has been featured on MSNBC, The Huffington Post, The New York Times, and most recently in Paul Tuck's book, How Children Succeed. Finally, Licia Clark joins us from Year Up Chicago, where she's an alum. She was born on the west side of Chicago and now works at UBS in the Global Asset Management Division as an infrastructure service lead. She's a graduate of the 3rd class of Year Up Chicago, an intensive one-year program that trains 18 to 24-year-old young adults in IT or finance to prepare them for 6-month-long internships and later for jobs with Fortune 500 companies. She still lives in the same neighborhood that she grew up in and is passionate about speaking out on the violence and disconnection that occurs in her community. She's spoken on Capitol Hill with congressmen, the Clinton Global Initiative, and to the Aspen Institute in hopes that these experiences she can bring back to her community and tell folks that they have not been forgotten. So obviously the experiences of the panelists speak for themselves, and I want to make sure we have the chance to have more of a conversation and dialogue than just sort of a transactional back and forth. So kind of starting on the big picture, looking at the state milieu and then getting down to really the neighborhood level, sort of how systems, programs, and policy are connecting, what those intersections might be, and how we can kind of move the conversation in a time with tighter budgets, less resources, and sort of more critical social demands than ever. So beginning with you, Representative Duncan, what are some of the key issues and policy levers you see at the state level, in Illinois specifically, and how does that fit into the context of the national conversation?
Well, first off, I'm happy to be here, Hailing, and you all have read about Chicago over the last couple of years on the tune of sort of the violence that has been portrayed over the media. And I'm here to tell you that it's real. And it's real serious on a lot of levels, given where I come up in public housing in Cabrini Green. For those of you who may or may not be familiar, you all have seen Good Times, right? Candyman, those tall condominiums in the sky. Right now, what we're dealing with are issues of really sort of displaced and abject poverty versus a resource-rich, segmented north side, east side, if you will, the downtown area, versus all those black communities, those brown communities, where there's access to an underground economy that is tremendous. I mean, can you imagine being 19, 22, which most of you all are now for the most part, making about $1,000 a day or $200 a day with little to no education? And then you run across a scenario where other folk want to get in that mix. They want that block. They want that section. And you're in an environment where the demand is so high and so intense, the customers, who are predominantly white or an addicted black population, they're fighting for your time and your attention. And they're giving you money for it. That's one of the undergirdings of sort of the current and now violence. And with us as policymakers not willing to invest the coin into prevention, from after-school programs, real simple, straightforward, preventive programs, the job training, to summer jobs, to after-school work, to really sort of wrapping around services to their parents who may be addicted, who may be grossly uneducated because they were raising kids in an environment that was pretty intense for them coming up. I grew up on the 13th floor of a 19-story public housing unit. You had about maybe 1,400 people in our building alone because there were 2 sections. You had about 8 apartments on each floor, 19-story. There were 7 of us in our 3-bedroom unit. My mother had to deal with a whole lot of sort of child-rearing dynamics with us, with her kids, yes, but she also had to compete against this poverty, for the most part, working class folk who were just isolated. And so, you know, poverty begets violence, and it's justifiable. You can't rationalize it sort of from an academic or a policy standpoint. It's just sort of survival of the fittest, and things sort of take its own course. But we have not, my colleagues in the House and in the Senate, and by the way, I'm here on behalf of the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus. I happen to chair the House and the Senate caucus. So this is not a Ken Duncan show. And I am recently been fighting our